right, just about got things set up. Just waiting for YouTube to tell me everything's working. Good. It looks like it is. All right, just switch back to that tab. And I think I think we are all logged in. Let me just.
Oh, you're both there.
Sometimes the camera doesn't show everyone. Remember, for the rest of you, you don't have to be shy. It's perfectly fine to allow your cameras to be on. It should be only for most of the lesson, just me on the YouTube, but don't be shy. All right, let me just double check our time. I'll give it just a touch more. And then we will get going. I hope everybody is having a great Pesach. Just a little tip for the season. When we are on a holiday or right before a holiday, the traditional greeting is Chag Sameach. Chag Sameach just means happy holiday. Chag is holiday and Sameach is happy. And it goes back, of course, to the way the Torah describes the holidays to give us happiness. But the Torah also talks about Moadim L'Simcha, about times for rejoicing. So the traditional greeting during the holiday, what we call Chol HaMoed, the middle days of a holiday, is Moadim L'Simcha, reminding people that even if it's not a holiday, actual Yom Tov day, we have to wait until Friday and Saturday for the last two from Pesach. But during the middle days, Chol HaMoed, we should still be rejoicing and doing a little bit more of the things that make us happy, without the bread, of course, during this particular time of year. So, Moadim L'Simcha is the traditional greeting during this time. And that's usable as well during Sukkot. All right, with that little tidbit, I think we can jump in and begin our discussion. So you may think that we've done Pesach and we're in the middle of Pesach. We've got the last 2 days of Pesach. Isn't that enough holidays? No, it isn't. The long winter lull where we only had Hanukkah and Purim and Tu B'Shvat, which is not really a holiday, but merely an important marker on the calendar. You know, they're not exactly the heavy guns. Pesach, now there's a holiday. And eventually, of course, Shavuot. And we'll talk about that next week. But in between, we have been blessed in the modern years, meaning the 20th century, with an additional 4 holidays between Pesach and Shavuot that were all invented, commemorate events during the 20th century. They were all originated in Medinat Yisrael, meaning the state of Israel, the modern country of Israel, and they are intimately connected to that country as well. However, they are not only celebrated in Israel, they are celebrated by Jews around the world. So I wanted to make sure that we had a chance to talk about them before they start happening so that you do not miss out. So let's go through these so-called modern holidays. So we have to get our context right first. We have to remember that the 20th century was a lot of change. It was a change for everywhere around the world. Old regimes were going, new countries were rising, new powers rose and fell. There was a lot of upheaval. Not that the 1800s were exactly calm, but the 20th century really was ending much of what had begun as a crash during the 1800s. And that includes the story of us. the Jewish people. We saw massive persecution in Europe, the likes of which we had not seen in Europe since the Spanish Inquisition. We saw mass immigration. More Jews were moving than ever before. Many were moving to the United States of America until the US stopped allowing Jews to come because of anti-Semitism and racism. Many others were going to the area that was called Palestine during the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, as we discussed during our history of the modern state of Israel. There was also massive upheaval in communal life. We talked about the different movements, the Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox movements. We talked also about how many Jews began to assimilate and leave the Jewish community when Jews began to identify and associate in many different ways than they had before. The freedom of choice brought with it, lo and behold, choices. And then, of course, there was the incredible darkness of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, where 6 million Jews were murdered, along with millions of others as well, by the Nazi regime, and many others were displaced from the life that they had been living in all of its diversity before World War II. And obviously, there was the miraculous rebirth of Israel as a state. Very important. I've mentioned this before, but it's really important to keep in mind Israel as a land, as a geographical area, has always been there, and Jews have always lived there. It wasn't always the majority of Jews, but there have always been Jews living in the boundaries of the land of Israel, what we call Eretz Yisrael in Hebrew. Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel, is a political entity. Just like North America has been here for a few million years, but the United States of America has only been here since 1776. So too, the land of Israel has been there forever, but the state of Israel in the modern form began in 1948. And that is, I cannot even begin to express how miraculous of an event that is, given that we had gone almost 2,000 years without having any Jewish control of the territory. Jewish people living there, but they were under foreign rule the entire time. So out of the 20th century, as you can see from this immense time of change, there became the need for many ways to commemorate some of the major events that had transpired. And that's what's going to give birth, that's what's going to give birth to these different celebrations and remembrances. Excuse me. So with the birth of the state of Israel as a state, as a political entity, it put it into a position which is still being debated, discussed, and figured out among world Jewry even to this day, but it definitely gave it a special position where it had not exactly authority, but influence to establish special days like other governments. And like other governments, and unlike other governments, the dates that are connected to the state of Israel have found their way into the Jewish communities around the world as well. Now, they don't have a legal authority over Jews around the world. Right? I'm not an Israeli citizen. I don't pay Israeli taxes. I don't get to vote in Israeli elections. I don't serve in the Israeli army. I am an American citizen, always have been. But we are influenced by what goes on in Israel, much like somebody who is an Anglican, meaning a member of the Church of England. Even if they live in Canada, Australia, or the United States, they are still heavily influenced by what goes on in the English church. So too, we are influenced by what goes on in Israeli life. The difference, of course, being is that these particular holidays were not established by the Rabbanut. They were not established by the rabbis of Israel. They were established by the government of Israel, by the secular authorities. And this is a very interesting point that you might have thought, and indeed we will talk about the religious implications, that these would be founded by religious institutions within the state of Israel. But the early state of Israel was, first of all, very secular, much more secular than it is today. And secondly, was still influenced by the Jewish pattern of culture and history, which means that when something amazing has happened, we celebrate it, and when something terrible has happened, we commemorate it, that we establish marks on our calendar. So even though they were not religious in an official sense, they were establishing holidays that fall into the pattern of religious holidays. And as we'll talk about later, indeed, these holidays, to one degree or another, have also taken on certain religious observances. So there are 3 days that have really created a huge impact, and then there's a 4th day which has had less impact. The 3 that have had the most in order of the calendar are Yomashowa, Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaAtzmaut. And then the day which has had a bit less impact, both in Israel and outside, although no less amazing for what it commemorates, is Yom Yerushalayim. And we're going to go through each one of these 4 in more detail, explaining exactly what they are, why they were established, and when you can look forward to celebrating or commemorating them. So let's begin with the next one. That is to say, the next one on the list, which is Yom HaShowa. Yom HaShowa is established on the 27th day of the Hebrew month of Nisan. That is the month that we are currently in. In this coming year, that is to say, this year, 2021, it'll be on Thursday, April 8th. That's next Thursday. Now, the official name is Yom HaZikaron LaShoah VeLaGvura. So that is the very, very fancy full name. Everybody just calls it Yom HaShowa. The fancy name, however, is important to know because it is described, according to the government edict which made it, as the day of remembrance for the Holocaust and heroism. And that last one's important. Now, this was established in 1953, about 8 years after Israel was created. The people were about 5 years after Israel was created, people were realizing that they needed to find a way to commemorate the trauma of the Holocaust in a way that would do honor to those who were in Europe at the time and affected by it, as well as help people find a healthy way to heal. Now, it was originally planned, when it was first being debated, to coincide with the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943. Now, that was on the 14th of Nisan. If you've been following your calendar recently, and I know you all have, that's the day before Pesach. That's the day that the Warsaw Ghetto rebels rose up in the largest single mass revolt against the Nazis during World War II. They did unfortunately lose, just like the other uprisings and revolts. It is very important to remember that the Jews were not completely passive during the Shoah, that there were numerous camp riots, revolts, escapes, and many attacks and partisan and uprisings throughout the European slaughter. And that was something that the new state of Israel really wanted to emphasize. So when they said that this is VeLaGvura, the day of heroism, as well as the Shoah, they really wanted to emphasize that during the Holocaust, that there were thousands and thousands of Jews who took up arms, who fought, and who died in a way more militarily, showing their resistance to the Nazis. And as a new state, one that had already fought one war in 1948, it was felt very important that this be highlighted. Now, over time, that the idea of the partisans and the uprisings has diminished, because although they were absolutely heroic and brave, it became more and more obvious that we also needed to celebrate the heroism of the survivors, those who went through the camps, who may never have held a rifle, but nonetheless held themselves, their families, and others together, and helped create a society, both in Israel and the other countries to which they resettled, that is still going today. And that we should not treat those who were unable to take up military resistance as though somehow they were lesser than those who did. And so the majority of the commemorations now focus by and large on those that were murdered during the Holocaust, the vast majority of whom were killed in the Nazi death machine, rather than through military action. But because putting Yom HaShoah the day before Pesach would completely ruin the holiday of Pesach, and indeed there is a law that we are not allowed to make the month of Nisan, the month of Passover, into one of mourning, it was decided to move it to 8 days before Yom HaAtzmaut. That is to say, 8 days before Israel's Independence Day, which, as you'll see, is very close. So this was a way to push it off from Passover, but still keep it close to that remembrance of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and still have both elements, both commemorating the death camps as well as commemorating the heroism, but without spoiling Pesach. However, before I get into the however, let's talk about how it is commemorated in Israel, and then we'll do the however, getting ahead of myself. So how is it commemorated? Well, if you are in Israel and you are there for Yom HaShoah, which if you are able to be is an incredibly moving experience, at 10 a.m., the air raid sirens wail throughout the country. Those of you who have never lived in a country where there are air raid sirens, have never heard the sound of that rising and falling warning sound, it can be very startling and very stirring. For 2 minutes, the entire country comes to a standstill. And I mean everywhere. Every car on the road stops, people get out of their cars, and they stand still. The sirens are broadcast through radios, through TVs. Everything across the country comes to a stop. And it is a remarkable scene to see the footage of the country coming to a complete dead stop. Now, throughout the rest of the day, places of entertainment are legally closed. So you will not be able to go find a movie on Yom HaShoah by law. The TV stations can only carry coverage of the commemoration ceremonies or documentaries about the Shoah, and the radio stations play somber music. As we'll talk in much more detail about the mourning practices in Judaism when we grieve, Judaism has long believed that you need to create forcibly a space for mourning, that you cannot simply feel sad when you feel like it. You have to carve out time to feel sad in, and you have to help yourself in order that you can properly grieve and express it. And here we see the entire country engaging in these practices. Any questions or comments?
I do have a question.
Yes.
For us being not in Israel, are we supposed to light like a yard site candle? For these
Indeed.
people to remember? Okay.
And that's exactly right. In the United States, or indeed in any country outside of Israel, there is a custom to light a Yom HaShoah candle, which is like a yard site candle. The Jewish Federation of Men's Clubs, which is the men's club through the United Synagogue, will often sell special made candles for this purpose. And that is one way that we do commemorate Yom HaShoah outside of the land of Israel. But there are other things that we do as well. Let me just pop up to that. So the conservative movement has added a special prayer into the Amidah, which reflects upon the tragedy of Yom HaShoah. And we have also created a special service called the Yom HaShoah Scroll that is used worldwide. Additionally, synagogues and federations and JCCs and other organizations around the world will use Yom HaShoah as a day for commemorative and educational events. And sometimes it's right on the day, sometimes it's a little before or a little after, depending upon where it falls during the week, in order to maximize the audience. And indeed, Yom HaShoah has become in many communities a very important day for not just the Jewish community, but also for inviting, teaching, and sharing with other non-Jews the lessons that the Holocaust has given us. So we do treat Yom HaShoah very seriously outside the land of Israel, even though we are not able, of course, to bring the country to a stop in quite the same way. Now it's back to my however. So like I said, the date was chosen to be 8 days before Yom HaAtzmaut, even though they wanted it to be the 14th of Nisan in order to give space for Passover. But as I also mentioned, Nisan is, by Jewish law, meant to be a month of rejoicing, and there are special rules on how we mourn in the more mundane situations during the month of Nisan. It is reduced. There is reduced grieving. However, this was considered such a significant event that the Jews of Israel established it on that day in order to keep the link. However, the chief rabbi in 1949, a few years before the proclamation of the government in 1953, he established that it should be commemorated on the 10th of Tevet. The 10th of Tevet, as those of you know, is one of the other days of commemoration for the siege and destruction of Jerusalem. And he felt that this was already an appropriate day. We have a long tradition of bundling different types of tragedies onto the different days of our mourning calendar. So it seemed to be appropriate. It would then include fasting automatically, which is another sign of mourning in many Jewish events. And most importantly for him, it was not in the joyous month of Nisan. It was not in the month that we don't have other types of personal mourning. Now, other rabbis suggested going further and rolling it into the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av, which we'll talk about later on in our curriculum. But the general belief among most Jews in Israel and around the world was that the Shoah, the Holocaust, was of such magnitude that it overruled the personal mourning restrictions because of the communal need, and that it needed to have its own day of separate commemoration, that it was so significant that you couldn't simply add it to a day that already had other tragedies, because as in scale, it simply stands by itself as a very narrow window of time when so many of people were destroyed in such a ruthless fashion. Even things like the Spanish Inquisition, which was absolutely devastating and disruptive to the Jews of Spain and the surrounding areas, can't really compare with the intensity and magnitude within such a short time that was unleashed by the Shoah. So the idea was that this was very important. And as I mentioned, the early state of Israel in particular really wanted to emphasize the resistance fighters, and so they really wanted to keep it as close as they could to that celebration of the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto. Questions or comments about Yom HaShoah then, before we move on to the next holiday? Okay. Now, when I say the next holiday, technically it's not next in line, but it was created, and then the other holiday that comes in the middle was split off. You'll understand as I explain. So Yom HaAtzmaut is Israel's Independence Day. It is on the 5th of Iyar, which is next month in the Jewish calendar. In the original date of May 14th, 1948, that was the 5th of Iyar. And as you know, the Jewish calendar is set by the Jewish months, meaning the Hebrew months, not by the secular months. And so that means Yom HaAtzmaut, like every other Jewish day of celebration, is going to move relative to the solar calendar. So although the first Yom HaAtzmaut was May 14th, afterwards, it's going to be on different days. And indeed, in this year, it's going to be on April 15th. So it is quite early in this particular year. So as we talked about in the Hebrew and the Jewish history of the establishment of the modern state of Israel, the UN vote of November 29th, 1947, also known as Partition Day, outlined the establishment of a Jewish and Palestinian state in the British Mandate of Palestine. There were supposed to be two countries. The British agreed to this partition, although they foresaw trouble, and said they would hand control over at midnight on May 14th. The Jewish groups also agreed. Not that it was exactly what we wanted at the time. There were still many issues that we were concerned with, but we were willing to cooperate and go along with the UN decision. The Arab nations, including the people living there, but all of the nations which are not primarily the people living in the territory, did not agree with this partition and declared war on May 15th, on the very next day. And you can look again at my history class on the establishment of the State of Israel for more information. So the fact that Israel survived and the fact that Israel established itself and fought a war, not that the war lasted one day, but fought a war from that point forward, means that Yom HaAtzmaut is a very powerful, very evocative, and very emotional day for all Israelis and for Jews around the world. And indeed, there are many people at our synagogue who remember Yom HaAtzmaut, who remember the day when Israel became a country. Unfortunately, many of them are passing away. They are reaching advanced age, but there are people who can still tell me about the day, hearing the vote on the radio, hearing the declaration, and the dancing in the streets in the Jewish neighborhoods around the world. So in the modern world, they want to make sure that they commemorate this with a lot of passion. And so many special events are held on this day. So the Israel Prize is given out. The Israel Prize is sort of like the Israeli Nobel Prize for people that have made great contributions to Israeli life and culture. They have an international Bible contest where people compete on biblical knowledge and trivia. The IDF does special showcases and tours where they show off the army, the military, and all of the things that are necessary to keep Israel safe. And many Israelis go on picnics and outings with their families, loved ones, and others. So this is an incredibly fun day. It is very much like the 4th of July in the United States, and it is universally celebrated and loved by almost all. As we've talked about before, there is a small extreme wing of Orthodoxy which does not believe that Israel as a political state is legitimate, and they are not fans of Yom HaAtzmaut. I always recommend, if somebody gives you a free Jewish calendar, check and see if their calendar calls the 5th of Iyar, this day, Yom HaAtzmaut, or sometimes they will leave it off completely, or sometimes they will rename it like Israel Day, and essentially whitewashing their reluctance to admit that the modern state of Israel is legitimate. It's a great litmus test of knowing where that organization stands by checking out their calendar. Yom HaAtzmaut is really what it should be called, in my humble opinion. Oh, come on. Scroll. There we go. So how do we come? Oh, go ahead. Yes?
It's your birthday.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. It's not the major reason to celebrate.
I planned that.
But the 5th of Iyar, the 5th of Iyar does happen to be my Hebrew birthday as well. So I am very fortunate because I not only know my Hebrew birthday very easily because I'm reminded of it constantly, but it means I never have to miss a celebration because while I'm celebrating Israel, I can also be happy about my own birthday too. But yes, so if you don't know your Hebrew birthday, that's a great reminder. And if you're not sure how to find it, just contact me and I'll be more than happy to help you do the calculations. It's not hard at all because we've got computers now. So in the conservative movement, we have taken the establishment of Israel as being a miraculous event. Now that has legal consequences with regards to Jewish law. So for example, we include a special paragraph, the Al HaNisim prayer in the Amidah, with a special text commemorating the miracle of the victory of 1948. There is also a special selection read from the Torah, Deuteronomy 7:12 to Deuteronomy 8:18, and a special reading from the prophet Isaiah, 10:32 to 12:6. So this is in keeping with how Judaism has commemorated other days by having Hallel, a special blessing, as well as readings from the Torah and Haftorah. And the conservative movement felt that this was an essential way to show that we do not think that the establishment of the state of Israel is merely a mundane, secular event, that although it may have been done by many people of many different varieties, that we believe that there is a hand at work in establishing Israel at this time. Whether or not Israel will flower into the full blossom of redemption that we hope and pray, We don't know because none of us are prophets. But by having the seed already planted, by having it come to at least this beginning of a bud, we now are closer to that promise than ever in the last 2,000 years. And we wish to make sure that we are showing our appreciation, our hope, and our belief that this is a perfect opportunity. Now, these practices are not obligatory because we have not established and cannot establish them as binding upon all Jews everywhere. But as I say, they are a reflection of our belief that this is a blessing to all Jews and that step towards redemption. So highly recommend, even if you're not able to join with a minyan, to not only include the Al Hanisim, to recite Hallel for yourself, but to also read the special texts on Yom HaAtzmaut. Now, around the community, around the world, you will also find on Yom HaAtzmaut numerous celebrations. This will be a time for parties, for special programs, for Israeli cultural events, lots of falafel, and many other activities that really highlight and celebrate our joy that Israel is an independent state, again, since 1948, for the first time in almost 2,000 years. So Yom HaAtzmaut is really one of the high points of the year. Very subdued last year. This year again is going to be, I'm sure, a little subdued because of COVID, but we will eventually get back to our full-throated celebrations. Don't worry. Questions or comments about Yom HaAtzmaut before we move on to Yom HaZikaron? Okay. Yom HaZikaron, which is known as the Remembrance Day, which is the 4th of Iyar. This coming year is on Wednesday, April 14th, 2021, which you'll notice is the day before Yom HaAtzmaut, and that is on purpose. So the full name of Yom HaZikaron, Remembrance Day, is Yom HaZikaron L'Chayalei Ma'acharot Yisrael V'Lanifka'ei Fulot Eva, which means the day of remembrance for Israeli fallen soldiers and victims of terrorism. So Yom HaZikaron commemorates not only those who fell while wearing a uniform, but also those who have been murdered by terrorists throughout Israel's years, which unfortunately has been a considerable number. And they too are considered to have fallen in defense of our land. Now, originally Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel's Independence Day that we talked about, originally Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut were the same day, meaning that you would have commemoration ceremonies and celebration ceremonies going on simultaneously. As you can imagine, regardless of what the state felt, families found it very hard to mourn their loved ones and celebrate the independence on the same day. Visiting the cemetery and visiting the barbecue on the same day is very, very hard. So the 4th of Iyar was selected in 1951 and was officially made law. Sometimes things take a while, but it was celebrated all the times in between in 1963. And there is a 1-minute siren at 8 p.m. And a 2-minute siren at 11 a.m. The 1 p.m. or the 8 p.m. siren is basically announcing that Yom HaZikaron is beginning. And then, of course, the 2-minute siren at 11 is very similar to the Yomashowa siren. The day then concludes by raising the flag back up to full mast and beginning the Yom HaAtzmaut, the Independence Day celebrations. So Yom HaZikaron has become this day of commemoration for the fallen of all types in Israel. And it has a bit less of a following outside of Israel, because most of the people who live outside of Israel have not served directly in the IDF, nor have they had direct loved ones fall. But over the last maybe 20 or so years, as the Israeli diaspora continues, meaning as the number of Israelis who have emigrated out of Israel and who live in other countries has increased, Yom HaZikaron has had more of a prominent place in the calendar of local communities. And here in Orlando, we always have an evening celebration and commemoration of the heroism and sacrifice of these people on Yom HaZikaron. Now, as you can see, putting it the day before means that when you come into the day of Yom HaAtzmaut, you have finished your grief, as such as grief can be finished, remembering that everybody in Israel either has lost a direct relative or a once removed relative, because it is such a small country with such a high proportion of people who have been injured and killed. It makes it more powerful to then celebrate the independence, having just remembered very personally the price that has been paid over the years in order to defend it. Questions or comments before we move on to our last modern holiday, which is Yom Yerushalayim? Okay. Yom Yerushalayim is also known as Jerusalem Day, is the 28th of ER, and this year it'll be celebrated on Monday, May 10th. Now, in 1948, going back to our discussion about partition, the UN decided that the British-controlled territory would become Israel. That's why we celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut after all. Now, part of it was given to a Jewish majority, and part was given to a Muslim majority. Now, Jerusalem was planned to be an international city, which neither new country would control. So it was meant to be just a separate floating entity run by the United Nations. That didn't work out so well. In the war that immediately followed, Jerusalem ended up being divided between Israel and Jordan. Israel had what is referred to as the New City, which is the western portion of the city of Jerusalem, and built outside the walls of the Old City. And Jordan claimed the Old City, which is the postcard version, if you will, along with the eastern neighborhoods of Jerusalem. Now, this was the result of that fighting, that war. There's still reverberations in modern politics, because at the time, with Jerusalem in such a state, Israel initially established Tel Aviv as its capital, fearful that Jordan would be able to attack and seize the leadership of the country by lunging across the border, which divided the city of Jerusalem. Israel very quickly went ahead and established Jerusalem as its capital in the Western New City section, and that is indeed where you will find the Knesset and the other offices of the government to this day. However, that has created friction, to be polite, with many countries refusing to acknowledge that Jerusalem is the capital. Now, there is debate over the divisibility of Jerusalem, as we'll see, but certainly the western portion, what is called the New City of Jerusalem, should not be in any doubt or dispute, except by those who believe that Israel is illegitimate whole stock. But that has unfortunately continued to this day to be an issue. So let's talk about why the 28th became Jerusalem Day. Well, from 1948 to 1967, for the first time in almost 2,000 years, Jews were not allowed to visit the Old City. The Jordanians instead took the Old City. You can see that here in the small little section in the center of the map. The Jordanians took the quarter that was the Jewish quarter, and they razed it to the ground. They destroyed much of it, destroying ancient synagogues and the homes that people had lived in for centuries, if not longer. And like I said, made the entire city off limit to Israelis. They also attacked Israelis from there, trusting that there would be no retaliation. Indeed, if you look at the buildings that are along, that still stand, that are along the outer western side that faced the wall of the Old City, you can see bullet holes on all of the buildings on the Israeli side, but you do not see bullet holes on the Jordanian side, because the Israelis would not fire into the walls of Jerusalem, but the Jordanians had no hesitation firing into the civilian areas of Israel. In 1967, in what we call the Six-Day War, Israel captured East Jerusalem. That is to say, Israel took the entire area here. You can see in the mini map, Israel took not only the rest of Jerusalem, but went all the way to the Jordan River. This unified the city for the first time after those 19 years of separation. And it was also, of course, the first time in almost 2,000 years that the city was entirely under Jewish rule. So as you can imagine, this is kind of a exciting moment for Israel. Now, like I mentioned, there was still politics and much debate and discussion. When people talk about the Green Line, they are talking about the original ceasefire line of 1948, which goes in that solid line here. And there are those among Israel's opponents that believe that Israel should pull back to here, at least. Many of them say it should be even further, which is a whole nother issue. And that the old city should be given to a Palestinian newly formed state. Israel has no intention of doing so. Whatever they may or may not do with some of the outer neighborhoods of the city of Jerusalem, certainly the old city is going to remain within the boundaries of Israel in perpetuity. I cannot imagine a Israeli government giving up the old city of Jerusalem to anyone. We have simply ached for Jerusalem for far too many hundreds of years to hand it over to anyone. So this means that it became a day of celebration. And indeed, after its capture in 67, the government established this annual day as its anniversary of celebration. And there are cultural and political events on that day. And the quote from Moshe Dayan, who was held as the architect of the victory of the Six-Day War, is often recited. So as he said, this morning, the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, liberated Jerusalem. We have united Jerusalem, the divided capital of Israel. We have returned to the holiest of our holy places, never to part from it again. To our Arab neighbors, we extend also at this hour, and with added emphasis at this hour, our hand in peace. Remember, this is literally in the midst of war. And to our Christian and Muslim fellow citizens, remembering, of course, that there are many Christian and Muslim citizens of Israel, we solemnly promise full religious freedom and rights. Indeed, the holy places in Jerusalem that are special to the different religions are administered by those religions. We did not come to Jerusalem for the sake of other people's holy places, and not to interfere with the adherents of other faiths, but in order to safeguard its entirety and to live there together with others in unity. And indeed, this has been how Israel has handled Jerusalem in the year since. Although there have been some Jewish extremists that have pushed hard to try and push more control across the area and put it under more Jewish and Israeli control, the Israeli governments of all types have consistently allowed the holy places of different faiths to be administered by the local population. Now, the day is still celebrated. It is still an official point on the calendar. It does still get attention, but it is not getting the same level of public participation as Yom HaAtzmaut. Remembering, of course, that Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel's Independence Day, is, of course, a universal feeling of jubilation. It is the birthday of the entire country, and most of the people who live in Israel who are descended from the early settlers have at least some person who has died in that struggle. Yom Yerushalayim is a little bit more narrow in its celebration, focusing on one city rather than the entire country, focusing on one battle and one victory rather than all, and as such, it has not inspired the same level of passion. Indeed, as Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz said in 2011, at its inception, Jerusalem Day was a glorious day. This feeling was to a great extent bound up with the Six-Day War and its outcome, which for a while produced the exalted feeling of release from dread and anxiety to liberation, well-being, and greatness. Over the years, however, the aura of the day has dimmed. So Yom Yerushalayim was established very soon after the Six-Day War, and there was a glow among the Jewish people in Israel and really around the world of amazement that in less than 20 years, this tiny little country had been able to not only hold its own against the massive armies of countries that outnumbered them 10 to 1, but to do so in a stunning victory that in many ways brought us closer to our vision of a reunified Jerusalem for our people than we ever dreamed possible only 20 years prior, let alone what had been dreamt 100 years prior. However, it turns out that 1967 was not the end. That is to say, as much as Israel thought that at that point they had proved to the Arab world and to their enemies that there was no point in engaging in war, that instead we should sit down and negotiate a peace, it turned out that their neighbors were not willing to do so. And so the victory of the Six-Day War and the capture of Jerusalem in particular, amazing though they are, were not the capstone on the experience of Israel, but instead were a major chapter that then turned the page after that celebration to find more wars, more tragedy, and more pain. So it does not have that same lasting feeling that we might have hoped for. Still, some Orthodox Reform and the conservative movement, some of us do recite Hallel on this day, Hallel being that collection of psalms that we recite on special occasions of national deliverance. This was promoted as well by the chief rabbi of Israel. However, many groups do not celebrate the day with any liturgical changes or additions, otherwise treating it as a regular day in prayer, even if you might watch a documentary or watch some of the celebrations from Israel. Thankfully, in the modern world, there are many more opportunities to participate, not only in Yom Yerushalayim, but in all of the celebrations and commemorations that I've discussed, because so much of what goes on in Israel is now live streamed, or at the very least recorded and able to be watched afterwards on YouTube, many of which are come with included translations. So we are able to feel a connection and kinship even more closely than before. And this allows us in many ways to truly appreciate the foresight of those in the 20th century who looked at these amazing sequence of events as along with the tragic and said, this should not simply pass unmarked. We need to make sure that we return to these days and these feelings so that we can properly blend them into our Jewish identity and our Jewish character. And so we have. And just in the same way that we did for Purim and for Hanukkah, two other events that also were felt very powerfully needed to be commemorated, along with those days of commemorating the tragedies of the destruction of the temples. So, although founded by secular people, these holidays have very much the right spirit of Jewish faith and Jewish hope and Jewish remembrance. And hopefully you all caught the dates that they are going to be commemorated on or celebrated. If not, please remember from our very first session, Hebcal, wonderful online Jewish calendar, Hebcal, Hebcal, and you can get a calendar right online, even download it to your smartphone or computer, and you won't miss any of the chances to have these amazing experiences. Any additional questions or comments? Okay. Well, then I will say thank you very much to everyone. It has been a joy, as always, to study and work, learn together. I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of Pesach. And remember our phrase, Moadim L'Simcha, as well as a good Chag for the final 2 days. I will see you all again next Thursday when we talk about the next holiday, Shavuot. Take care, everyone.